Hi friends, Prepared Suburbanite back at you with some more thoughts about the end of the world, doomsday, and the S hitting the fan. Did a little bit of research in response to a conversation that we had here at the family just a couple days ago about what are the big causes for the S hitting the fan. So I'm going to share with you what we came up with. So stick around. So we basically came up with 6 different categories of how the end of the world is going to happen, how the S is going to hit the fan, and we tried to categorize this and then kind of rate them by their perceived or potential impact and their probabilities. So let's start with number 1, natural disasters. Having just gone through Hurricane Florence a couple of weeks ago, a natural disaster has a pretty high probability of occurring no matter where you are. And we're talking about hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, fires, forest fires, that kind of a thing. Some of them are very regional. You're not going to get hurricanes in Kansas, but you are going to get tornadoes. You're probably not going to get ridiculous amounts of snowfall in Florida, but you are going to get hit with a hurricane from time to time. So there are those types of natural disasters that we all believed would have a temporary effect, but a pretty high effect, impact on individuals that are impacted in that area where the hurricane, the flood, the fire, the tornado actually hits. Probability is pretty high. I say on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is like the most probable, it's in that range of 8 to 10, depending on where you may be located. Then there are other natural disasters that kind of come in a little bit lower ranking, but not necessarily any less devastating. We got earthquakes. Now, the San Andreas Fault, the California, there's a number of fault lines here and there around the country. An earthquake can be pretty damaging. Probably temporary in nature. I mean, once the ground is done shaking and the buildings are damaged and all that, it's not going to last very long. Rebuilding is probably going to be the first order after the dust settles. So, but it's going to have a pretty high probability, depending on the seriousness of the Richter scale and the earthquake kind of a thing. Chances of it happening, the probability, I think we all agreed in our family anyway, and be interested to hear what you may think when we get all through all this. We kind of gave it a medium probability, maybe on a scale of 1 to 10, somewhere between a 3 and a 5. So it's kind of on the low end to medium. Then there are other types of natural disasters that we had to factor into this equation under natural disasters. A volcano. Now, the biggest threat that has been potentially defined is the Yellowstone caldera, the supervolcano that's apparently long overdue for hitting the United States at least, but it could have some global impact. But if that thing goes off with the intensity that it could go off, that's going to have global impacts. So, and it may be pretty close to being a permanent kind of a thing, depending on how big the plume is, how big the explosion is, how big the ash cloud is, how far it travels. There could be season after season after season of failed crops because there's no sunshine coming in, kind of a volcanic nuclear winter per se. So, but it could have huge, and even permanent damage. So we give it on a scale of 1 to 10, probably close to a 10, if not the 10. Probability, pretty low until it happens. But we kind of gave it a 1 to 2 because there is that possibility. It does appear, based on historical records, that it's overdue right now. But it's still a pretty low probability of happening. A pandemic. We lumped it under natural disasters because it is kind of a natural thing unless, you do some kind of bio attack from terrorism. But let's just call it the natural evolution of a disease process or a virus or whatever may cause the pandemic. That can be local, very localized. Ebola is very localized right now, but it could spread and become regional in an instant. It could be national. When I'm thinking national here in the States, I mean, if something really kicked into play here, it could have national impacts. And it could be global. I mean, it could be one of those kinds of things like the Spanish flu in 1918 kind of a thing, and it just pretty much was worldwide, had a huge impact for a very short period of time, but that's how it happened. It could be temporary, and it could be permanent. I mean, we could have a mass extinction of the human population as a result of the most serious pandemic that you could ever possibly think of, and it could wipe out 90% of the human population. Likelihood, probably not, but it will have an impact. So temporary, low end, permanent, high end, probability of it happening, pretty low. I think we've got enough scientists and medical people and researchers and all that are trying to stay ahead of these kinds of things. We'll see. Hopefully that's correct. Number two, economic. Now, not necessarily in second place, but it's the second one on our list. And it could be number one if it happens, obviously. But economic on a scale can go anywhere from an individual job loss, where all of a sudden the company you work for goes out of business and whoop, you don't have a job. That's an economic kind of a thing. Depending on how well prepared you are with your emergency fund and with whatever other planning and preparations you've done in case of an economic disaster at your household on a personal basis, it could have very minimal effects. It could have disastrous effects. You could lose your house, you could lose your car, you could, have foreclosures and all that. So just kind of one of those things that you really should be being prepared for, is to have that emergency fund available for a personal economic disaster. So beyond job loss, then we get into market corrections, market recessions, and even market depressions, where the economy goes into a negative spin. Now, a correction, yeah, it's a negative spin, generally pretty temporary. It's defined very specifically by the economists as being a certain number of percentage points below some sort of running average. And we were close to having a correction recently. I'm not sure we actually hit the perfect definition of the correction, but be that as it may, it did have a little bit of an impact. I think there was a little bit of market panic going on because of the correction. The index, the Dow index and the Standard & Poor's and the NASDAQ were tailing down after being very lofty at very, very high levels. But it was temporary. It's all come back now. It's only been a couple of months, 6 months maybe. and we're back in full swing again, setting new records for market for the markets in general. Recessions and depressions, well, we've been through, if you've been around as long as I have, been through a couple of recessions here and there, and they are temporary in nature but can have a huge impact. Folks that had 401ks and IRAs and 403bs, when the market valuation tanked during the recessions at the end of the 1990s and into the early 2000s there, folks lost a lot of money. They lost a lot of market cap in their investment portfolio. And then a lot of folks started making really dumb decisions, selling things at a loss, stopping their contributions to their 403bs and 401ks during a period of time where you could actually buy more, as if you had any confidence left in the economy, so that you could come back a little bit. The recession, I'm not old enough to remember actually living through the Depression, but I sure did hear an awful lot of stories from my parents and my grandparents about what the Depression was like. And it was pretty bad. Food lines, people just didn't have jobs. There was nothing really going on. It was not just local or even regional. This was nationwide, and it went on for such a long period of time that there was all kinds of despair, suicides, and uprooted families, and all kinds of nasty stuff that happened. But those are the kinds of economic disasters that can cause an S hitting the fan that gives you some rationale for being prepared and being ready for something like that. Now, the probabilities of that happening, we determined for a market recession, maybe on a scale of 1 to 10, somewhere between 4 and 6. For a depression, even less chance, maybe 2 out of a 10. And then a full economic global collapse that could happen. Who knows what could be the cause of that? We may wake up tomorrow morning and find out that, the whole thing has gone to hell in a handbasket, and there is no global economy anymore, and everybody's in a panic, and the whole thing is global, and everybody's running around like chickens with their heads cut off. That could happen. I don't think there's too much recorded history that says, yeah, that's happened on this date and this date and this date, but the potential is there. That could happen. We gave it about a 0.5 on a scale of 1 to 10. But the impact could be huge. I mean, just gigantic. All kinds of other trickle-down kinds of issues that could stem from both a depression and a worldwide global economic collapse. Okay, third on our list is terrorism. And we did lump a number of things together under this particular category: cyber attacks, infrastructure attacks, electromagnetic pulse from a high altitude nuclear detonation with an EMP that can cause a grid down, kind of a thing. That could be an act of terrorism, so we lumped it under terrorism. Chances of that occurring on a accidental or even natural basis is next to nothing. So we figured it would have to be a precursor to an attempt at World War III, a global war kind of a thing. So we lumped it under terrorism, figuring that, yeah, there are a number of countries that do have the wherewithal to do something like that. And if they did it right, it could take the grid down, and that could be absolutely devastating. I watched how fast the water, milk, and bread disappeared from the local supermarkets around here when we had a threat of Hurricane Florence a couple of weeks ago. I can't imagine what it would be like if there was a grid down, no power kind of a situation, and how much panic there would be in the streets. It's just unbelievable to even try to conceptualize what rational and normal people will react to a situation like that. Beyond the EMP kind of a thing under terrorism is bioterror. Now, I can remember back in the early 2000s, there was, the threat of the anthrax stuff being mailed to certain congressmen and senators and stuff like that. But that could happen. That could be a tool that terrorists could use to be able to disrupt the normal flow of life here in our political climate. It could be very devastating. That could get into the water systems, could get into the food systems. It could be pretty nasty. All right, next up on our list was number 4, which we labeled political and social. And that could range anywhere from the riots and the demonstrations that we saw in Kansas City and in Baltimore over the last couple of years, where it was triggered by some social cause. A young fella got shot by the police, and the whole city of Ferguson was basically in flames. Just all kinds of terrible things. The same thing went on in Baltimore a few months later, where that place was just a total mess. But that's the kind of social unrest that can lead to rioting. I'd say it's pretty localized. It could be regional in a sense, but those are the kinds of things that can cause an S-HTF kind of a situation, at least on a local or regional basis. If your town's in flames, if there are activists and protesters throwing rocks and bottles and breaking windows and setting cars on fire and doing whatever they're doing, blocking traffic, you're not going to feel safe going to the supermarket. You're not going to feel safe, just going through the normal routine of life. So for a short period of time anyway, the S has hit the fan, at least in that regional kind of a thing. Now, it can go beyond that, and I'm not sure what the trigger could be. It may not be anything that you and I would even consider all that bad at this particular point in time, but other folks would think, oh my God, this is really the root cause for a revolt, a revolution, a civil war right here in the United States. I don't know what can trigger it. It could be anything from Trump getting reelected to the current nonsense that's going on in Capitol Hill with the Supreme Court nomination process that's going on. We're seeing all kinds of slings and arrows and nonsense going on, and protests, and people getting stormed out of restaurants, and threats to family, and it gets crazy. But it could escalate depending on whatever situation may pop up. It could escalate so that we could potentially be in another second Civil War kind of a situation right here in the United States. I don't think I ever want to see that happen. It could really have a devastating impact, on a scale of 1 to 10. The impact could be in that 9 to 10 range. The probability I consider very, very low. But that's my opinion. We'll see what happens. Number 5 on our list was war, World War III. However it starts, whoever pushes the button, whatever happens, it could be Iran. They've threatened to wipe us off the face of the planet. It could be Russia. It could be China. It could be North Korea. It could be pretty much anything. But we could be the victims of an attack in a wartime setting. Chances are a little bit greater it could simply be a conventional kind of a war where they may want to, the Russians may want to take Alaska or Hawaii or whatever, but they could invade our shores. It could be on the east side, could be on the west coast, not quite sure, but that's a possibility of the S hitting the fan. If we get attacked by a foreign power, Lord knows what that's going to do to the infrastructure here, the food supply, water infrastructure. It's really hard to say. Beyond the conventional factor in conventional warfare, we could be a victim of nuclear war. And there are countries that are perfectly capable of dropping a nuclear weapon on us. They could hit LA, Chicago, and New York, pretty much wipe us right out with 3 good-sized atomic bombs. What would we have left? Not much. So, but the chances of that happening on a scale of 1 to 10, we're saying conventional war and even nuclear war with a lesser chance, way less than 1 on a scale of 1 to 10. But the impact could be huge. And then there was like the oddball category, which was number 6. And we just called it other because there really isn't a good name for it. A coronal mass ejection. Yeah, we could have put it under a natural disaster because, you know, I guess that would fall under natural disaster, but it has happened. The Carrington event back 100 plus years ago, and all we really had for electronics at the time was telegraph, but it pretty much fried everything that was electronic, fried that whole infrastructure that supported telegraphy at the time. But if it happened today with that same intensity that the Carrington event had, we could be in a grid down situation for months and months, even years. So it's a possibility because it has happened. The impact would be disastrous. The chances of it happening, pretty low. The asteroid and the comet kind of a scenario. Yeah, it's happened. Go ask the dinosaurs how they made out. But it could happen. Yeah, odds makers are taking bets on it and stuff like that. I just wish I'd be around after the fact to collect the money. There is a small, tiny percent chance that we could get hit with a global destructive comet or asteroid. We've got folks that are well aware that there's a situation or a chance that that could happen. They're looking for it. They've got satellites out there. Yeah, they could miss it. We're human. But it could happen. Could be a global extinction event. Could be very regional. There was the thing that happened in Russia back 100 years ago where it just knocked down all the trees in Siberia somewhere. Could be at that level. But if that was to happen over New York City or Los Angeles, the loss of life, the loss of infrastructure could be devastating. So, but because it has happened, there's a chance that it can happen again. Impacts can range from little to global. Chances of it happening, very, very tiny. And then, to round it out, I guess there's the biblical Armageddon scenario. If you're a believer, the second coming, that could happen. It's been foretold. The whole book of Revelations there. That's up to you. I'm not sure that there's anything you can do to prepare for that, but if you're a believer, it's something that you may want to consider. So those are the 6 topics, the 6 general areas that our group felt that were most likely to happen. We looked at the impact, we looked at the probability. That's kind of what we came up with. Look at your own personal situation. Look at where you are. Look at what you've got. Look at your budget. Look at your available funds. look at the potentials against any of these kinds of things happening. Put your preparation plan together and begin the execution of that plan. Water, shelter, food, a means for self-defense. You really can't go wrong if you plan for the worst case scenario and take the baby steps to get there, the steps, that step of, the first step in 1,000 miles kind of a thing. It never hurts to be prepared. In fact, it's always the best medicine. So be prepared always. This is the Prepared Suburbanite reminding you to be prepared, and I'll see you all on the next video.